Hello Year 9, here is your 8th lesson then on An Inspector Goole. So we've got 3 questions today. So the first thing we're going to do is revise what we mean by socialist. So can you list some of Priestley's socialist beliefs? So think back to what we've learned about what Priestley believes in. Yesterday we looked at evasive. So think about how is Eric presented as evasive in the last section of the play that we read yesterday. And our new word today is omniscient. So let's think about what we mean by omniscient. Okay, so omniscient is someone who knows everything. Okay, someone who is all-knowing and almost godlike. So you can pause the video and just write that definition down. Okay, we're not going to worry about our question for omniscient because obviously you guys haven't read Romeo and Juliet yet, because we are doing Inspector Goole a little bit earlier than we normally would. So just think about our question here about socialism and our question here about being evasive. So you can pause the video and answer these 2 questions. So some of Priestley's socialist beliefs then. Priestley wanted to get rid of the class system because he believed that it promoted inequality between the classes. He believed that the rich exploited and manipulated the poor, that the rich got rich off the labour and the hard work of the poor. He believed that the poor deserved a fair wage, a decent way of life. He believed that the rich had a responsibility to care for the poor, to be considerate and use their power for good. How is Eric presented as evasive? Well, they start talking, remember from yesterday, about a girl or women's clothes, women and the idea that clothes is a sign of their self-respect, and Eric mentions as if he started talking about a girl and then suddenly sort of shuts himself up and doesn't want to reveal anymore, showing that he's got something to hide regarding a girl. So we've looked already at omniscient, this idea of someone who's all-knowing and almost godlike in their knowledge. So today we're going to explain how Priestley uses language to develop our first impression of Inspector Goole. So by the end of the lesson you will know Priestley's beliefs and how these are represented through Inspector Goole, how Priestley uses language to develop our impression of his character, how this impression links to Priestley's beliefs and intentions in writing the novel. So we are going to look at the next section of the play, and we're going to think a little bit more about Gerald and Burling teasing Eric and Eric continuing to be evasive here. So I will go back over to our other screen. Hopefully this will pick up from where we left yesterday.
Somebody at the front door.
Edna will answer it. Have another glass of port, Gerald. Then we'll join the ladies. That'll stop me giving good advice.
Yes, you piled it on a bit tonight, Father.
Ah, special occasion. I'm feeling contented. I wanted you to have the benefit of my experience.
Please, sir, an inspector's called to see you.
An inspector? What kind of inspector?
A police inspector. He says his name's Goole.
Goole? No, I don't know him.
He says it's important, sir.
All right, well, show him in then.
Yes, sir.
I'm still on the bench. It may be something about a warrant.
Oh, sure to be. Unless Eric's been up to something. And that would be awkward, wouldn't it?
Oh, very.
Here, what do you mean?
Only something we were talking about when you were out. A joke, really.
Well, I don't think it's very funny.
What's the matter with you?
Nothing.
Inspector Goole.
So what we have here again is this reminder that Mr. Burling and Gerald have picked up on this idea that Eric's trying to hide something, and they have interestingly linked that into the fact that this police inspector is on his way. Now, what they're referring to as it being awkward is obviously Mr. Burling has said, well, I'm likely to get a knighthood as long as we don't get into trouble with the police force. And they're only joking, but Eric actually, again, becomes even more defensive and evasive about this idea that the inspector's there because of something he has done. So Priestley is wanting to, again, foreshadow this idea that Eric is potentially involved in the reason why Inspector Goole is there. So you can pause the video and I'd just like you to answer these two questions. What is the purpose of Gerald and Mr. Burling teasing Eric, who continues to be evasive? So why do you think Priestley has done that? And how do you think Priestley wants us to react to this? So you could pause the video and answer those questions. So the purpose really is to foreshadow the fact that Eric has got something to hide, and that Eric is likely involved in the reason why the police inspector is there. It's also obviously building up dramatic tension. We want to keep watching. We want to find out what's going to happen. You know, Priestley wants us to possibly feel a little bit sorry for Eric. It's showing that Mr. Burling and Gerald yet again seem to be on the same side. But again, he's also wanting us to try and piece the clues together as the play progresses, because, you know, this is essentially part of the detective genre, and, you know, part of the detective or crime genre is us, the reader or the audience, having the clues and putting those clues together. So we're going to look at the next section of the play. Now, obviously, if we have the script in front of us, and some of you may in fact be following along with the script on your computer, we're given now some stage directions for the inspector. So the inspector enters and Edna goes, closing the door after her. The inspector need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s, dressed in a plain, darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So just like the opening stage directions where it revealed our first impressions of the Burling family and Gerald, we now have some stage directions giving us our first impression of the inspector. So what I would like you to do is pause the video quickly and just make some brief notes. What impression do you get of the inspector based on this description on the slide? Why do you think Priestley wants us to have this impression? And then make some brief notes, and then we will go through it together. So pause the video and do that now. So, even though the inspector may not be physically large, he creates a sense of massiveness. So he's quite intimidating, even though he's not physically intimidating. There's something about him. He has a real presence in a room. And this idea of speaking carefully and weightily and having a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking, he's intimidating. He is intelligent. He speaks carefully. He weighs and considers what he says before he says it. So here is a man with a very large presence. So we are going to read the next section of the play then, and then come back and think about these questions. So we're going to consider our first impression of the inspector based on the way he speaks with Mr. Burling, Gerald and Eric. Okay, so that's what you can have a think about while we're here.
Mr. Burling? Yes. All right, Edna.
Yes, sir.
You're new, aren't you, Inspector?
Yes, sir. Recently transferred.
I was an alderman for years, and Lord Mayor 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench. So I know the Brumley police officers pretty well. I thought I'd never seen you before. Well, what can I do for you?
I'd like some information, if you don't mind. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She was taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out.
My God.
Yes.
Now, that person that says, my God, is Eric. So Eric's initial reaction to the agonising suicide of this poor girl is to go, my God, that's awful. So compare his reaction to Mr. Burling and Gerald's. But the inspector has come here because this girl has committed suicide.
She was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course.
Horrible business. But I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector.
I've been round to the room she had, and she'd left a letter there. And a sort of diary. Like a lot of these young women who get into trouble, she'd used more than one name. But her real name was Eva Smith.
Eva Smith.
Do you remember her, Mr. Burling?
Well, I seem to remember hearing that name somewhere, but it doesn't convey anything to me.
She was employed in your works at one time.
Oh, that's it, is it? Well, we've several hundred young women there, you know, and they keep changing.
But this young woman, Eva Smith, was a bit out of the ordinary. I found this photograph of her in her lodgings. Perhaps you'd remember her from that.
May I see that photograph too?
Not just at the moment, sir.
Any particular reason why not?
There might be.
And the same applies to me, I suppose.
Yes.
I can't imagine what it could be.
Neither can I.
It's the way I like to work. One person and one line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, there's a muddle.
So, we're going to go back to our PowerPoint now. And we're going to think about that initial impression of the inspector that we have just been given. Now remember, the inspector is a lower social class than Mr. Burling, Eric, and particularly Gerald. The inspector would be a lower middle class in terms of his job. So he would, or the Burlings and Gerald would certainly expect to be treated with a certain level of respect. So we're going to think about how the inspector speaks and behaves. We're going to consider his social class in comparison to Mr. Burling and Gerald. Does the inspector's behaviour surprise you here? Think about the way that he speaks, particularly just before we paused. You know, the way he is talking back to and disagreeing with the fact that Gerald and Eric want to see this photograph, but he won't let them. Think about how he speaks to them. And again, you may want to look at the Word document that will have been attached to the email again, and have a little bit of a look at this section and look at some of the stage directions if you're able. Think about how the characters appear to react to him. And think about how he comes across as omniscient. Now remember, omniscient is all-knowing. So a girl has died, and she has left a sort of diary and some letters that he's found. And the contents of those diaries and letters has led him to come to the Burling family, where he's presumably going to ask them some questions. And we know already that Eva Smith worked in one of Mr. Burling's factories. So how is he coming across as omniscient and all-knowing? So we can pause the video here and make some of those notes. So the inspector's behaviour is surprising because as a lower middle class status, he should be speaking more respectfully to the characters, you know, because he should be afraid that they could use their status to make him lose his job, maybe, or to get him into trouble. But instead, he speaks to them as if he is not intimidated by their status. And again, you'll see in the stage directions, he's speaking very carefully, weightily, calmly. He's not intimidated by them, not even the aristocrat Gerald. And how do the other characters react? Well, particularly Gerald and Eric, towards the end of that section, they are quite surprised that an inspector is talking back to them and denying them something. And even Mr. Burling is a little bit taken aback by him. And as we go into our lesson tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the sort of power dynamic between the inspector and Mr. Burling and how that develops in the next section of the play. So how does he come across as being omniscient? Well, because of these letters and these diaries, he knows how the Burling family are connected to this girl, but the Burling family don't know that yet. You know, he appears to have an awful lot of information, and he's not necessarily coming to the Burling family to learn anything new. He's coming to confirm what he already knows. And that idea of him being omniscient adds to the presence that he has on stage, and the fact that he does come across as intimidating. So what I would like you to do now is just write a brief summary of Inspector Goole. So you might want to think about the stage direction description of him, the way he speaks to the other characters, the way they react to him, and what Priestley's intentions can be. Okay, so you don't have to write more than a couple of sentences, but I do want you to just write a summary. What are your first impressions of Inspector Goole? Okay, so even if it's just a few sentences, you can pause the video and get that done. So here is our final feedback then. So how is the inspector presented as a socialist so far in the play? Now, we don't have an awful lot of information regarding this yet. But think about this idea of him his arrival interrupting Mr. Burling's speech. Think about the way he doesn't seem intimidated by the status of Burling's. And again, how could the timing of the inspector's arrival present him as omniscient? So why arrive at that particular moment in Mr. Burling's speech? How could that present him as omniscient? Okay, well done, and I will see you for our next lesson tomorrow.